The moment Jake wiped the grease from his hands and slipped into his only clean shirt, he knew he was making a mistake. His coworker Danny had insisted, practically begged, that he go on this blind date at Giovanni's, the kind of restaurant where Jake couldn't afford the appetizers. But Danny had been relentless, claiming his girlfriend's friend was perfect for him. So there Jake sat, his calloused fingers wrapped nervously around a water glass, watching couples in expensive clothes laugh over wine he couldn't pronounce, wondering what he was doing in a world that clearly wasn't meant for people like him, mechanics who smelled like motor oil no matter how hard they scrubbed. The restaurant glowed with soft amber lighting, the kind that made everyone look like they belonged on a magazine cover. Jake had arrived 15 minutes early, his anxiety turning every tick of the clock into an eternity. He'd chosen a table near the window, trying to appear casual as he checked his phone for the 100th time. No message from Danny with a description of his date. No photo. Nothing. Just, table by the window, 7 p.m., you'll know her when you see her. At 7:15, Jake's stomach churned with a familiar feeling, the one that reminded him he didn't belong in places like this. He was about to leave when he noticed her. A woman in a wheelchair sat alone 2 tables away, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes distant as she stared out the window. She wore a simple blue dress that somehow seemed more elegant than all the designer clothes around her. Her dark hair fell softly around her face, and there was something heartbreaking about the way she sat there, as if she'd been waiting for someone who would never come. Without thinking, Jake stood up. Maybe it was the years of watching his mother struggle alone after his father left. Maybe it was the countless times he'd been invisible to people who thought a mechanic wasn't worth their time. But something in that moment made him walk over to her table. "Excuse me," he said softly, his voice rougher than he intended. "Is anyone sitting with you?" She looked up, surprise flickering across her face. Her eyes were a striking green, the kind that held both sadness and strength. No, my date cancelled, last minute." She tried to smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Mine too, I think," Jake lied, glancing back at his empty table. "Would you mind if I joined you? Seems wrong to waste a reservation at a place like this." For a moment, she studied him, really looked at him in a way that made him feel exposed. Then, slowly, she nodded. "I'm Sophie." "Jake." He sat down across from her, immediately feeling self-conscious about his off-the-rack shirt and the tiny oil stain he'd missed on his collar. They ordered, Sophie insisting on splitting the cheapest entrees when she noticed Jake's discomfort with the prices. As they waited for their food, conversation came surprisingly easy. Sophie had a sharp wit that caught him off guard, and she laughed at his stories about disastrous car repairs and demanding customers. She told him about her work in art restoration, her eyes lighting up as she described bringing faded paintings back to life. "It's about patience," she said, her fingers tracing patterns on the tablecloth. "Everyone wants instant results, but real restoration takes time. You have to care about every tiny detail. Like rebuilding an engine," Jake offered, and she smiled, a real smile this time. Exactly like that. It was halfway through dinner when 3 men in expensive suits approached their table. Jake's body tensed instinctively, recognizing the kind of men who'd looked down on him his entire life. "Sophie, your father's been looking for you," the tallest one said, his voice clipped. His eyes barely registered Jake's existence. "He wants you back at the event. You know how important tonight is." "I told him I wasn't attending, Marcus," Sophie replied, her voice steady but tired. "I'm having dinner." Marcus's gaze finally landed on Jake, and the disdain was immediate. "With him, Sophie, don't be ridiculous. You're Robert Hastings' daughter. You can't what? Have dinner with someone I actually enjoy talking to." Sophie's voice had steel in it now. "Go back and tell my father I'll see him tomorrow." Jake's mind reeled. Robert Hastings. The name was plastered on half the buildings downtown. Hastings Industries, the manufacturing empire that employed thousands. And Sophie was his daughter. The daughter who, according to office gossip Jake had overheard at the parts supplier, had been in a car accident 2 years ago that left her paralyzed and turned her into a recluse. The men left, but the magic of the evening had cracked. Sophie stared at her plate, her shoulders tight with tension. "You didn't know who I was, did you?" she asked quietly. "No," Jake admitted, But I don't care. She looked up sharply. Everyone cares. That's all anyone sees. The Hastings name, the wheelchair, the tragedy. No one sees me anymore. I see you, Jake said simply. I see someone who loves art restoration and has a terrible sense of humor and who's been nicer to me in 1 hour than most people are in a year. Tears welled in Sophie's eyes, and she quickly looked away, embarrassed. But Jake reached across the table, his rough hand covering hers gently. They talked until the restaurant began closing around them, sharing stories and dreams and fears with the kind of honesty that only happens when two people have nothing to lose. Jake learned about Sophie's accident, how she'd been driving to surprise her father at his office when a truck ran a red light. How she'd spent months in rehabilitation, fighting to regain independence. How her fiancé had left her 2 weeks after she came home from the hospital, unable to handle her new reality. Jake told her about growing up poor, about putting himself through technical school while working 2 jobs, about the small garage he dreamed of owning someday where he could hire kids like him, the ones everyone else overlooked. "You'll do it," Sophie said with certainty. "I can tell. You're the kind of person who doesn't give up." "Neither are you," Jake countered. When they finally left the restaurant, Jake insisted on walking Sophie to her car, a modified van with handicap controls that probably cost more than he'd make in 5 years. The driver stepped out, but Sophie waved him back. "Jake," she said, and he could hear the hesitation in her voice. "Would you want to see me again? I mean, I know this was all just a weird accident, and you probably—" "Yes," he interrupted. "Tomorrow, if you're free. Though maybe somewhere less fancy. I know a diner that makes the best apple pie in the city." Her smile could have powered the streetlights. "I love apple pie." 3 months later, Jake stood in the lobby of Hastings Industries, feeling distinctly out of place in his one good suit. Robert Hastings had finally demanded to meet the mechanic dating his daughter. Jake expected hostility, maybe security escorting him out. Instead, he found a tired-looking man who studied him with the same sharp green eyes as Sophie. "My daughter tells me you're opening your own garage," Robert said without preamble. "Yes, sir. Small operation. Just me and 2 employees to start. She also tells me you hire people others won't give a chance. People with records, kids from rough backgrounds." Jake straightened. "Everyone deserves a second chance, sir." Robert was quiet for a long moment. Then, he stood, extending his hand. "I've spent 2 years watching my daughter disappear. You brought her back. That's worth more than any business degree or pedigree." He paused, his voice rough with emotion. "She laughs again. Do you understand? She laughs." Jake shook his hand, his throat tight. "And Jake, that garage of yours, it's going to need a business loan. Consider it approved." A year later, at their wedding in Sophie's mother's garden, Jake's small garage had grown into 3 locations, employing 23 people who'd been told they'd never amount to anything. Sophie had returned to her art restoration work, her studio filled with laughter and the smell of paint. As they danced under the stars, Sophie whispered, "Best wrong table I ever sat at." Jake pulled her closer, this woman who'd seen past his grease-stained hands to the man underneath, who'd taught him that love wasn't about perfection but about showing up. Sometimes the best things in life happen when we have the courage to sit at the wrong table.